Hey guys, Assalamualaikum. Welcome back to another lecture video. In today's video, we're going to enter a new topic, which is fiscal policy. Okay, so if you recall from one of my early lectures, I did mention that in this class, we will be looking at only the demand side policies. Okay, so demand side policies are basically policies that influence the aggregate demand. Okay, so there'll be two types of demand side policies, which are fiscal policy and the monetary policy. So here will be the first one of the demand side policies that we should be looking at. Okay, when we're talking about fiscal policy, fiscal policy, okay, there are generally two types. Okay, two types. One is the discretionary fiscal policy. Another one is non-discretionary fiscal policy. Okay, so we will look at these two separately. Okay, so under discretionary fiscal policy, we have a further two, which are expansionary fiscal policy and contractionary fiscal policy. So in today's video, we will be looking at discretionary fiscal policy and expansionary. Okay, let's take a look at the definition of fiscal policy. Okay, so fiscal policy is a government policy that deliberately changes government spending and or tax collections to achieve full employment, control inflation, and encourage economic growth. Okay, we can actually break down this definition into several parts for you to understand it better. Okay, number one, the key word here is deliberately, but this is basically what it means by this fiscal policy being discretionary. Okay, in that the government will quote unquote manually adjust how the government or the authorities respond to any changes in the economy. Okay, so this is what it means by deliberately changes. And you can see there are two tools of fiscal policy here. The tools are government spending. So you know what this is. This is G. This is the G component of our GDP. Okay, if you remember, government spending, G, and or tax collection, T. Okay, so we have G and T. So G and T are both the tools of fiscal policy. Now, what is this? To achieve full employment, to control inflation, and encourage economic growth. This is basically one of the most important macroeconomic objectives. All right, so hopefully you understand what the definition of fiscal policy is from this. Okay, here I've included the assumptions. Okay, when we want to learn fiscal policy, particularly discretionary fiscal policy, we make several assumptions. Number one, the government spending has no effect on planned investment. In other words, but the public spending is independent of private spending. Okay, and as I mentioned to you just now, fiscal policy is one of the demand side policies. Therefore, fiscal policy will only affect aggregate demand, not aggregate supply. Okay, let's look at expansionary fiscal policy. Okay, so what is expansionary fiscal policy? The key word here is expansionary. Now, the root word is expand. You know what expand means? Wanting to make something bigger or grow, right? So why do you think the government would want to do that? What's going on in the economy that makes it possible for the government to want the economy to grow? Yeah, so that means the problem is, initially, our problem is we have some sort of recession or high levels of unemployment. That is why the government would adopt expansionary fiscal policy to help the economy recover. Okay, so let's sketch our problem first. So remember, our problem is we have a recession. Okay, the problem that we have is a recession or high unemployment. Okay, so that's our problem. So we want to sketch that. All right, so what does it mean by a recession? There's a fall in output, fall in income, okay, fall in trade, fall in production, okay. So what it means is it will affect our aggregate demand curve, yeah. So our aggregate demand curve will shift to the left, okay. So that's basically what it is. Okay, so we have shifting. This is initially 81, okay. So here we can see there's a fall in our aggregate demand curve, okay. Now, remember that the price does not fall. Okay, remember in the last video, we talked about the ratchet effect. What it means is prices are sticky downwards. So although there's a fall in aggregate demand, prices actually still remain at P1. So what happens is when we have a recession, okay, we have a new intersection point here. This would be the fall in GDP, okay? So if you're wondering where I got all these figures, it's from the textbook, okay? So if you don't have the textbook with you, don't worry. You can just look at these example, okay? So initially, so it's 490 here. Sorry, it's 510 here. Okay. Let me repeat that. Initially, our aggregate supply and aggregate demand. This was the initial equilibrium at 510 billion. So when we have a recession, what it means is the aggregate demand curve shifts to the left, okay? But due to the ratchet effect, prices maintain at P1, but we have a much lower GDP or aggregate quantity, okay, at 490 billion, okay, right? So this is basically our problem, okay? We have a recession, okay? This is basically what we draw. So this is our problem. Now, since we acknowledge this is our problem, what we need to do, we need to apply the expansionary fiscal policy, right? So how will that take place? Okay, what happens is, since here the problem is we have a fall in aggregate demand, so now the government would want to increase back the aggregate demand. Okay, so we want to go from 82, go back to 81. Okay, so how can we do that? Now remember, there are two tools, right, of fiscal policy. What was the tool just now? Okay, the first tool was government spending, okay, or government expenditure, and then the second tool is taxation. So these two, we can use it to solve this problem. So I'm going to show you one by one how we achieve that. Now, before we move on with the example, a little bit of information more. Let's say in this economy, the MPC is given as 0.75. Again, I got all these figures from the textbook, okay? And we can see here, what's the drop in GDP? Just find the difference. 20, right? So there's a $20 billion fall in GDP. How do we get 20? Just minus lah. 510 minus 490. Okay, so you've got several figures. We've got 20 billion and we've got the MPC 0.75. So why do you think they gave you the MPC? It is to find the multiplier. Yeah, okay, so how much is the multiplier in this economy? Remember, multiplier is 1 over MPS. Okay, so MPS is 1 minus MPC, which is 1 over 0.25. So we can get, it's 4, okay? So in this economy, the multiplier is 4. Remember that, okay? Why do we need to remember this? I'll show you in a bit. Okay, so we've got two figures here. We have here 4, which is a multiplier. And then here we have the fall in GDP 20. So basically this is the change that we want to get back. Okay, that we had a fall in GDP by 20 billion. So we want to get back this 20 billion. Now, how much would aggregate demand need to increase to get back that 20 billion? Okay, so we cannot say that AD needs to increase by 20 billion. Why? Because we have the multiplier here. Okay, what it means is, remember in the video, aggregate demand, I mentioned to you that when the aggregate demand curve shifts, there are actually two shifts, right? The first one is the first or initial change. This is the first change that happens. What is the initial change? It would be any component of spending. It's either G, C, IG, or XN. Okay, that's the first increase. Okay, and then the second increase would be the full effect, which is due to the multiplier. Okay, so we see here, we know that the change that we want to get back is 20. So how much should be the initial change? Okay, we can play around multiplying or dividing, whatever, but this is actually a shortcut way to know it. Remember, there's another formula, right, for multiplier. Okay, this is one formula. The other multiplier formula is, remember, multiplier is basically the change in GDP, right, over change in initial spending. Okay, so now we know the multiplier is 4, right? So we know the change in GDP is 20, but we don't know this. This is our x, the unknown. So how can we get x? Just normal algebra, it becomes 4x over 20. So x is 5. Yeah, so basically the amount of initial change that we have to take first is 5 billion. Right? So this first point should be 5 billion. What is the 5 billion? It could be anything. It could be an increase in consumption or increase in G. It could be increase in XN. But remember, we're talking about expansionary fiscal policy. So we know that the tool is G. Okay, let's look at this first. So it has to be G. So please, if you're explaining in exams or whatever, do know what we're talking about. Okay, we're talking about fiscal policy, so you have to mention it's government spending, not other components of the GDP. All right? Okay, so anyway, let's start again. We already calculated here. This should be our initial spending. Okay, so our initial spending should be $5 billion worth of government spending. So this one would be 5 billion. That 5 billion multiply by 4, which is multiplier, will give us the full effect of 20 billion. So basically that is how we solve this problem using G. Okay, so now let's look at how can we achieve expansionary fiscal policy by using the second tool, which is taxation. Okay, so now the effect will be the same, okay guys? So we don't really need to sketch another diagram. You can use the same diagram, but the calculations will be slightly different, okay? Remember, all of these calculations that I showed you before, this was for change in G. Okay, so now we want to show how can we use taxation as a tool to achieve the same effect. Now let's go back here and see. The same backstory applies, okay? So we had a recession. Okay, we had a recession. That is why GDP falls by 20 billion. And still the same, our economy has a multiplier of 4. Okay, but now what can we do with T? Now here, when we have a recession, what we need to do is to increase G, right? So let me be a bit more specific. G here, we have to increase it. Okay, increase G. But what can we do with T? Are we going to increase T as well? No, okay. Why? Because the ultimate effect is we want to increase spending, right? We want to increase spending. So logically, how to increase spending if the tool is T? We have to reduce taxation, okay? Right. Why is this why is it like this? Okay, if you recall in the topic basic macro relationship, there's a relationship between income, consumption and savings, right? I think I did mention to you at the time what happens when there's a fall in tax. Okay, when there's a fall in tax by a certain amount, okay, what happens is disposable income will increase, right? By how much? By that same amount. Okay, see? If there's a fall in tax, my T is missing, sorry. Okay, when there's a fall in taxation by a certain amount, the disposable income will increase by that same amount. Okay, and then we know that when disposable income changes, or in this case increase, what happens is consumption will also increase, savings will also increase, right? So how much do these two change? Well, it depends on the MPC and MPS, and that is why they gave you these figures much earlier. Okay, right. Okay, so now let's go back here. So how much would the fall in T be? You might think maybe it's 5. Okay, that's where it's incorrect. Okay, increase in government spending is 5 billion, true. But we cannot reduce taxation by also 5 billion. Why? Because G is a direct component of aggregate demand. Remember, aggregate demand is equivalent to aggregate expenditure. Aggregate expenditure is equivalent to how much we spend, right? The collective buyers, which are C, IG, G, and XN. So G is a direct component of AD. So that's why we can straight away put 5 here. But T, there's no T in AD. Okay, so how T works, how taxation works is it's an indirect. Okay, it indirectly influences aggregate demand. So taxation here affects aggregate demand through what? Through C. Okay, so can you see? I repeat again. G is a direct component of AD. That's why we can straight away put 5 here. However, T is an indirect. T, if you want to target aggregate demand through T, we have to use G. So you see, it's like a long cut, long way. Here goes here, and then only it goes here. Okay, so we cannot use 5. the number or the figure has to be bigger. Okay, a bit bigger. So how can we do that? But we do know that it has to be 5 billion, right? It has to be 5 billion increase in initial spending. Only that it's in consumption now. So how much will it be? So it can't be 5. So what we do is we take this working backwards. Okay, in a way we're going to work a bit backwards. So how does it, how did we get increase in C here? 0.75, which is the MPC multiplied by the change or the X, then we will be able to get this change, right? Correct? Okay, I repeat. MPC 0.75 multiplied with the X. X is the unknown, what we want to find lah. Okay, then here we will get what is the initial change. So we know that the C, okay, the C must be 5. How we know 5? Here, it has to be 5, right? So we know the change in consumption must be 5. So we know the MPC is 75%. So we want to know X. X is the unknown. So how can we get X, guys? Basic algebra. 5 divided by the MPC. Okay, I'm running out of space. Okay, 5 over 0.75. So we will get 6.67 billion. Okay, so what is this? This will be the change in T. Okay, so that's basically how you explain it. All right, the government needs to reduce taxation by 6.67 billion. When that happens, consumption will increase by 5 billion. And then you can use the same diagram. Okay, now we can say consumption increases by 5 billion initially, and due to the multiply effect, 5 billion of consumption times the multiplier 4, we will get back the full amount of 20 billion. So what happens is the agreed demand curve will go back to the original position. Okay, so to recap, when there is a recession, okay, what the government can do is to adopt the expansionary fiscal policy. How? By either increasing government spending or reducing taxation. Okay, and of course there's actually a third way, which is to have a combination of both. Okay, combined, a combination of both G and T. So the thing is, regardless whichever method you choose, it will get the same result. Okay, we can still use the same diagram. Okay, so just now we said that we wanted to, okay, when the problem was there's a change in, what was the problem just now? There's a fall, change or a fall in GDP by 20, right? 20 billion. Okay, so that was our problem. So how much government spending to increase? 5, right? So the problem was, the solution was increase G by 5 billion. Okay, why? Because when we increase government spending by 5 billion, 5 multiplied with the multiplier will get back 20. Okay, and that's it. And then just now the second way was by reducing taxation. By how much? We reduced taxation by 6.67 billion. Remember, we cannot reduce taxation by the same amount because taxation is an indirect component of aggregate demand, so it has to be more. Okay, so what it means here, when there's a fall in T by 6.67, what it means is there's an increase in disposable income by 6.67. This one will lead to an increase in C. By how much? By multiplier, sorry, the MPC 0.75 times 6.67 will get 5. Okay, again, when 5 multiply with the multiplier, you'll get back 20. Okay, so anyway, see, can you see here? Regardless, whichever you choose, you'll go back and get that lost GDP. Okay, right. Now let's look at the third method or option, combination. Okay, well, how it works with combination here is it's entirely up to you really how much the composition of G and T that you want to choose, but you do know that, okay, here's the G, how much would the G be and how much would the T be? Okay, by how much? Okay, but you know that the total, okay, what's more important is the total. Total spending should be 5 billion. Okay, because this would be the amount that has to change first. Then only this one multiply with the multiplier, it will give you the lost GDP. Okay, so you can actually play around with some figures. Let's say you want to increase government spending, say by I don't know, 1.25 billion, okay, since government spending is a direct component, so you can just put here straight away. So we want to increase G by 1.25 billion. Okay, cool. Right, so how much should the fall in T be? So we just find the difference, 5 minus 1.25, so we'll get 3.75 billion, right? So we know that if we increase G by 1.25 billion, the consumption must be increased by 3.75 billion. So how much would a fall in taxation need to be to get this amount? So all we need to do is we take 3.75 billion, then we just divide it by the MPC, then you will get. So here would be 5 billion. Okay. How do you get this 5 again? 3.75 billion divided by the MPC, so we get this. So we're basically just moving backwards. Okay, so let's recap. These are basically what we need to do, or what the government can do to stimulate the economy in the event that there's a recession. Number 1, we increase government spending. Number 2, we reduce taxation. Or number 3, we can do a combination of both.